Okay, wonderful. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am very glad to be back here tonight with all of you for the final session of this book talk series, but of course, don't worry, more programs to come in 2023. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone. We like to know who's in the room with us. And of course, put questions in there throughout the conversation and I'll weave them into our discussion. We are really delighted to be able to continue gathering together from all around the world for meaningful conversation and learning. And we're grateful to Jewish Live for streaming with us. A few quick words about JWA for anyone who's new to us. We are a digital archive that works to expand and transform the way we understand history and culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We know that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us envision and create a better world. And the book talks are just one piece of our work. I hope you'll check out jwa.org and explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. I'm very happy and honored tonight to welcome tonight's speaker. Dr. Elana Maryles Sztokman is an award-winning feminist author, anthropologist, and activist. She's the author of 6 books so far on gender and society and is a 2-time winner of the National Jewish Book Council Award. Her most recent book, which we'll be talking about tonight, When Rabbis Abuse, Power, Gender, and Status, and the Dynamics of Sexual Abuse in Jewish Culture. Elana is also the creator of the Jewish Feminist Academy, which I have been honored to teach in, where she offers courses and content to help shape conversations about gender in Jewish life. She writes and speaks and consults with groups and organizations around the world on gender issues and women's experiences. And she comes to us tonight from Israel, where it is now 3 a.m. So she is super dedicated to being here for this conversation. Welcome, Elana. So glad to have you with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Judith. And of course, I agreed to do 3 o'clock in the morning. First of all, because I'm a big fan of JWA, and this series is a phenomenal series. I really enjoyed the talks, but also, Judith, because I want to tell you, and I want to tell everyone, that the conversations that you and I have had in these kinds of forums are among my most favorite in the world. You know, I really, just as you were talking about how this program nourishes you, I feel like these relationships nourish me as well in these conversations. And I'm so grateful to you, Judith, for all that you do and all that you speak out about. And so it's really an honor and a privilege for me to be here with you.
Thank you, Elana. I feel similarly. It's wonderful to know that you are out there doing your work. I'm always really just amazed by your bravery and just how much of a straight shooter you are. Really a model of speaking truth to power and knowing that, you know, there's this international network of Jewish feminists who are doing the work is incredibly just strengthening in difficult times. So thank you so much. It was wonderful to read this book. I'm really glad that it's out there. It was also hard to read this book. And actually, I just want to say before we begin that give a little bit of a trigger warning of sorts. We're going to be talking about difficult topics tonight, and we know that these topics can be triggering for many people, including us. So we hope you'll be patient with us, that you'll be gentle with yourself, and be part of the conversation as much as you can. And we'll just honor the feelings that come up, because I'm sure there will be. So this was given what a hard book it is even to read, I imagine it was a very hard book to write. What brought you to the decision that this was a project that you needed to take on?
The decision to write it was sort of slow in coming. It took about 7 years to work on this book. It started really with an article that I wrote shortly after the Barry Freundel story. I don't know if you all remember the Barry Freundel. He was the what we call the Peeping Tom rabbi, and he put hidden cameras in the mikvah, in the ritual bath that he was responsible for, and he had 160 or 170 victims, where he would he would in the guise of being their rabbi in charge of their conversions or the rabbis of their synagogue, he would make them do, practice dips, and he would tell them exactly where to stand so that he would get the best view. And so that story, when that came out, that really affected me. You might say it was triggering for me in a certain sense, because as someone who I spent most of my adult life as a practicing, religious woman, and was using the mikvah, and using the mikvah requires you to put aside a certain hesitation and doubt in order to trust that the system is going to be protecting you on some level. And so it was like your worst fears coming true kind of thing. So that was really hard for me and I think a lot of other women, and it sent me on this path of talking to other people and talking to other women, how they were affected by it. And sort of one thing led to another, and I wrote about it. And the more I wrote about it, the more people shared with me their experiences and their stories. And then I wrote again. And the more I would write, the more I would hear stories. And what was particularly interesting for me about the Freundel story was that there was no physical contact involved, right? So it's non-contact sexual abuse. And so some of the reactions were like, oh, nothing happened. It was no big deal. It wasn't rape, that kind of thing. I had a very jarring experience shortly after his sentencing. He was sentenced to 4.5 years, which, more than that, it worked out to about 4 months per victim. So something like that, 3 or 4 months per victim. And so I was invited to be on this radio panel with a few other panelists. And the moderator kept saying, why did he get such a terrible sentence? Why so long? Right? There were, 160 women that he did this to. So but the interviewer kept saying, what, nothing happened. It wasn't rape. That's what he said. It wasn't rape. It's, who was hurt? Nothing.
Right.
And so I found myself in this position of sort of like having to explain that sexual abuse isn't just rape, and that the victimization happens on a lot of layers. And so in this particular case, because Freundel was the gatekeeper to religion for a lot of women, he was the head of conversion for the RCA, for the Rabbinical Council of America. He was single-handedly, handling negotiations with the chief rabbis of Israel about which rabbis in Israel would have their conversions accepted. Or so he said. A year before this happened, I was at a conference of the AJC where it was leaders, Jewish leaders from all around discussing conversion in Judaism, and Freundel was the keynote speaker, and he had written a paper that was a discussion of the entire day of the conference. So he had this like really serious platform and power and gatekeeping ability for so many people around their Jewish life and Jewish identity. And so when the gatekeeper to all of that violates your trust and violates your intimacy in such a profound way, and is basically using that platform in order to fulfill his own sexual fantasies, the damage is so deep and so multi-layered. If someone, you can just picture, like if someone's going through conversion with Freundel and he discovers that when he said, oh yes, you must do a practice dunk because that's halakhically the thing to do, and you discover it wasn't halakhic at all, it was just what he wanted in order to see you naked. What is your relationship with Judaism going to be after that? Right. That's the real question. So those kinds of questions really drove me to keep digging and to keep digging and to keep asking. And the more that I dug, the bigger the issue became, or the more I saw is really more correct. The more I kept scratching away at the surface, the deeper it went. And so this was in 2014-15 that all of this started happening, which was before Me Too, before Harvey Weinstein, before Brett Kavanaugh, before Donald Trump, and each of these, larger events impacted all of us. And all of us were in the same sort of process of like scratching the surface a little more and having these conversations. So with each of these public conversations, I was discovering, we were all sort of discovering more and acquiring sort of language and understanding. And so that was the process that I was going through with my interviews as well. So I would like start a few interviews and then something would happen and I'd have to revisit things, and then I'd explore some more and revisit some more and redefine and reevaluate. So that was a 7-year process, basically, from the time that, I started this till the book came out, because we were all in this process of giving these definitions and
Right.
having these understandings and re-examining our own lives, in a lot of ways. So, yeah.
And being in some ways for some people kind of re-traumatized as different stories came up in the news, and you kind of have to live different things. I mean, I think part of what's interesting as you're retelling the story of Frendel, like it brings up some of the themes that you talk about in your book, the sort of the gatekeeping aspect of the role of particular people who have a lot of power over, who is included in the community or who gets to be promoted in certain ways or become Jewish, and also the ways in which abusers often seek out people who are vulnerable, and certainly people who are seeking to convert are in that, who are they to talk back or to question anything? It's like, we see those trends emerging even just in that case. And I thought that was part of what was really powerful about your book, is being able to kind of look at all of those stories together and notice some of the patterns and be able to call those out from the particular cases.
Yeah, that was really my main goal, is to tell that story as a cultural story. So one of the interesting things is I get a lot, the most common feedback that I get from readers is, you left someone out, or how come you didn't mention this guy? I get that all the time. Not just this guy, also, people of all genders. Like, I just want to put out there also, by the way, that people of all genders can be abusers and people of all genders can be victims. So it's not really a men versus women thing. It's just, but that's part of the patriarchy is part of the story in its own way. But what I wanted to say is that hang on a second. Oh, I lost my thought. Hang on a second. You were talking about 3 o'clock in the morning. That's the risk. Is that your brain? Your brain is quite a
We were talking about, you were saying how that people will often say you left out this person or that person, that your goal was to kind of not be comprehensive necessarily, but to.
So what I was saying was that this isn't investigative journalism. My goal was not to out people, and my goal was not to tell a specific story about a specific person. My goal was to talk about the culture. Because I come from anthropology and sociology, and so I wanted to tell the cultural story. So that's exactly what I wanted to do, is to find those patterns. So for some people that's hard, because it's, some people are looking for kind of like particular justice. They want to know that the person who abused them, will be reading this. But I feel like that wasn't the purpose of this book. The purpose was to sort of talk more broadly and give people language and patterns to see, to really know what they're walking into. So like if you're sitting in a board meeting or a shul meeting or a PTA meeting, and something like this comes up, and somebody describes a dynamic which has, certain aspects to it of control and manipulation and all of that, that people are able to say, oh, I recognize that. That's a grooming tactic. For example, or that's an emotionally manipulative tactic, or that's a power tactic. And so that's really the goal of this book, is to paint that portrait rather than focus on a particular abuser. And part of the reason also is because what happens when we focus on a particular abuser, a lot of times then the discussion becomes about that person, and it becomes about the person who is making the claims, and the accusing is like, oh, can we trust that person? Maybe she's, misremembering, or maybe she, has a vendetta, or maybe she's just, a disgruntled employee, or maybe she has mental health issues, or maybe she has an anger management problem, or she's not really likable anyway, or so it becomes that, or you focus on the abuse, on the abuser, and then it becomes, oh, but he's so great, and he gives such a good sermon, and people love him, or he's,
or maybe in some cases it's oh, he's terrible, but he's exceptional, that we're not going to learn something broader from that. We're just going to say he's a bad guy and not necessarily notice what the other dynamics are that might be happening in a community that might not be that extreme. We have a question about whether this book is limited to Orthodox rabbis. And actually, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, the book actually isn't limited to rabbis at all. You talk about rabbis as one example of particular figures and power dynamics, but you talk about a lot more than just rabbis. So I'm curious about, why you chose to, for
Yeah.
main focus to be rabbis, but not exclusively rabbis, and sort of how you
Yeah.
kind of approach that.
Yeah. So first of all, in terms of the rabbis who are who the interviewees talk about, it's not Orthodox rabbis at all. It's all denominations are represented, I have to say, which was not something done on purpose. It was just how it happened. Of my 80-something interviews plus other kinds of sources, including, by the way, the JWA research that we incorporated as well. So it is not Orthodox rabbis, but it is interesting that I get that question all the time. Oh, like one of my Orthodox interviewees said, oh, because mostly what you're talking about is just Reform rabbis, right? So it cuts both ways. Like everybody likes to say, oh, it's somewhere else. The problem is in some other denomination. So I get that a lot, but it's not at all. It's really everywhere. The reason why I focused on rabbis, even though I didn't set out to say, oh, let me go look at rabbis who are abusive. I really wanted to understand sexual abuse in the Jewish community in general. But I ended up focusing on rabbis because of how dominant those narratives were in the interviews. It really just struck me how often I kept hearing the stories about rabbis. At least half of my interviewees were talking about rabbis. And so that's why I decided to put the focus there and start to look at what rabbis, what the particular dynamics are and how rabbis use the tools at their disposal and the trust that people are given, that people give them, the intimacy that they have with people, the way they have special access to people at their vulnerable moments, the way they, people are always like, oh, you got to trust the rabbi, the assumption of virtue that we give rabbis. So all of these are like tools that enable abusers. But what I ended up doing is using the rabbi as more of a paradigm of power in the Jewish community. It's not just rabbis, it's also bosses and professors and academics and donors and board members, especially donors, by the way. What I found is that donors have the most impunity. Donors are the least, even like when there was a massive New York Times expose about Charles Steinhardt with, sorry, Michael Steinhardt, sorry about that. Yeah, big like warning. It's when there was a massive expose about him with people using their real names, high status women in the community, executive directors of many of our organizations who are coming out and saying that this has been going on for 30 years. Nothing happened. There wasn't a single, there were some feminist organizations that sort of called on the major Jewish organizations who are getting money from him to speak out and say something, but none did, not a single one. So as opposed to, for example, with the story of, let's say, when Karen McGinnity came out about the story about Stephen Cohen. So he did lose his job and he did, retire or whatever, even if, he had a sort of half comeback later on because he had supporters, because so many of these abusers have supporters. But at least, there was we had that moment of reckoning with him. But with donors, we haven't even had that. There has not been a single act of reckoning with any of the donors, because donors are still, considered untouchable.
Right. Although you point out that that's not necessarily the case for women donors, that there are women who are board members or major donors who can still end up getting harassed or abused in various ways, and somehow their money doesn't quite protect them in the same way.
Exactly. So there's that, which is, so women are also often in this lose-lose situation. Even when women have a certain power or status in the community, they still don't receive the same kind of support necessarily that their male counterparts would get.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, Karen is on here. Hi, Karen. Cohen resigned under duress. His comeback attempt was stopped by hundreds of rabbis, Baruch Hashem. And kudos to you, Karen, for being a model here for the rest of us.
And you can hear Karen interviewed in JWA's podcast episode about Me Too, and we'll put that link in the chat as well. Yes. And we have a question here also about the ways, about how do colleagues of rabbis react? Do they,
Yeah.
is there sort of, you write quite a bit about this, about sort of the systems that
Yeah.
help prop rabbis up or protect rabbis in these situations. Tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about that.
Yeah. So, one of the really painful lessons that I learned here was how much people like to be adjacent to power, so that the more high powered an abuser is, the more likely they are to have a network of support. That's a really, really hard lesson. And this, again, cuts across all denominations, even, and so in some denominations, this is more, let's say, formal, that there are rabbinic networks and all that. In the Orthodox community is actually less formal networks. There's no equivalent of, like the CCAR in Orthodoxy, like that doesn't exist in the Orthodox community. And yet, there's still these really tight networks of support for people who are considered celebrities, basically. It's, or people of power. So that exists in rabbinic networks, but also in the community in general. There was one woman who told me her story that she was abused in one particular organization, but the organization was very closely tied to 3 other organizations. They were all sort of, partnering and networking. And she approached all of them to try to deal with this, with the person who was abusing her. She had there were 7 other victims who were also describing abuse. And the organization even had mechanisms in place for reporting. But none of that mattered because the person who was doing the abusing was so, valued as a speaker, effectively, as a speaker teacher on the, seminar, workshop, conference circuit, could pull it. So that's really hard to come up against. And that repeats itself over and over again. So as one of the things that I really, really recommended strongly at the end was for us as a community to revisit those cultures of, high-powered people supporting other high-powered people, no matter what, especially around issues of money and status. Like, what is that? Also, because what does that say about us as a community? It's not just, and another one of the things that I argue for is that it's not just individuals who are hurt by all this. It's our entire community that's hurt. It's our culture that is hurt by it, because we're saying, like, what kind of culture do we have? What are our values? What are the things that, come before everything else? Who counts? Who are the people who really count? Right. So these are really difficult issues. And every time that somebody comes with a story like that, like, oh, my community, is supporting the abuser, and I feel like I have no place to go anymore, or I dropped out of my synagogue, or I dropped out of my job, or I stopped working in Jewish communal life because of all of this. Like, that damages all of us. That's yeah.
Right. You write very beautifully in the book about, you talk about some of the individual impacts, which, I think we can all imagine in terms of people's mental health, people's financial capacity, people's jobs, all kinds of things. But that also there's a communal impact of the talent that we lose, of people who might have worked in the Jewish community and leave, of the members of our community who could have been important, just people in our midst who we could have learned from, and who could have been leaders who absent themselves because they don't have a place. And then it also undermines our sense of what our values are as a community. And I think it's complicated, right? Like, part of what I think, sometimes I think when we look at a case like Harvey Weinstein, right, where he just seems kind of evil, right? He has no redeeming value, basically. Like, he seems just like there are so many things about him that are disgusting. But that's not true of a lot of abusers. A lot of abusers are incredibly charismatic. They might be very learned. They can be very appealing and good at their jobs in various ways. And so It's easy to focus on those things and say, these things don't jibe. And so my brain can't take that this person could also be an abuser, because this is not what we think an abuser looks like, or because I value this other thing so much that I don't want to let go of. And then, of course, people are also implicated in certain ways, right? Like, in terms of talking about, if you work with someone, then if they are going to be taken down, you might also lose your job. Your power is associated with their power, or, I think also it can be hard to, a lot of people, I think one of the things you say in the book, which I think is really important, is that we really need to learn that just because we haven't experienced something from someone, that doesn't mean that he doesn't do it to somebody else, right? So
exactly.
sort of being able to say, and we see this in all kinds of ways, that people will defend someone and say, oh, but they're so nice to me. It's like, okay, that can be true. No one's saying they're not nice to you. They're saying, but you have to trust someone else. And then there's the piece that's just so painful that underlies it, which is that ultimately, and we don't like to think about it in these terms, but when we say like, and I'm really restating what you already said, but just because it's so important, when we say that, well, this person is so learned, or they're such a good leader, or they're so caring, or they give such good sermons, we're basically saying that matters more than this other person's personhood. And we don't always think about it in those terms, but I think it's really important to put it in those terms of like, what are we devaluing when we hold up somebody's particular contribution at the expense of another human being?
Yes, exactly. Yes to everything you just said. I would go even further. I would say that all abusers have redeeming values. I mean, you think that Harvey Weinstein doesn't have redeeming values, but people love his movies, right? We're still watching his movies. We're still watching his movies, right? All abusers, and also the reason why people didn't come forward before then was because he was able to make or break careers. So he had that. Today we're able to, let's say, for the most part, see past that. But all abusers have redeeming values, and in a lot of cases, with people that I interviewed, some of them were things that are often deeply valued, such as not just giving a good sermon, but also doing a nice wedding and playing music. There's the Karl Bach model of the person who like knows how to uplift, an entire room of people with their music. Like that comes up a lot, for example. So there's that, even though it's interesting to me that the same personality traits that it takes to uplift a room, which is basically a form of emotional manipulation, we want to be emotionally moved. So those are the same qualities that abusers also use in private. And I also saw somebody posted here that they can also be very nice. Like that's also true. It's the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing, where the abuser can be abusive, and also at sometimes be very nice, sometimes at the same time, right? Or sometimes it sounds like it's the same time. They're sort of getting what they want from you at the same time that they're telling you things, like they might be saying like, but you're so special and you're chosen by God, and but this you're destined for, and only I see you and only I know you, and I'm doing this and I know that this is like there is a lot of emotional manipulation where in the grooming process, where a lot of times the abuser will be the one saying exactly what the victim needs to hear, for example. And so that's really confusing. It could be like really, really confusing. But it's because I love you. That I love you, and I see you in ways that nobody else does. And like there's a lot of language that abusers have that make it seem like that they're able to make themselves seem like they're doing a great thing, or so it's really difficult.
So there was a question about how this compares with other kinds of clergy abuse. And I think it's interesting to see sort of like where there are continuities across religious backgrounds, like how much of what you see from rabbis is similar to the culture around priests and abuse. And then also you write about things that are specific to Judaism. So say a little bit about what's similar, and then we can talk a little bit about what are some of the specific to the Jewish community tactics that you have in your research.
Yeah, the similarities are vast. I mean, the grooming tactics pretty much cut across all types of abusers, of all of that, of targeting the vulnerable victim, finding their points of vulnerability, people who are going through a thing, whether it's, death or divorce or just spiritual quests or even unemployment or searching for a new community, anything, or like you mentioned before, somebody who's maybe recently converted or undergoing conversion, or all of these things that create vulnerability, and the abusers in all different areas will look for those points of vulnerability. All the grooming tactics on some level resemble each other. The main difference in the grooming tactics is not the tactic itself, but the cultural tools and the cultural lingo, the cultural settings, So if priests have their particular settings of, communion or altar boys and all of that. So we don't have altar boys, but we have lots of other things. We have the kiddush after shul, or we have the pastoral care moment, I have one of my interviewees was, just trigger warning. Okay. She was raped by her rabbi at her grandmother's funeral, so she thought he was being like caring, and he kept saying like, she's special and stuff. And so, but he 1000% manipulated her at a moment that he saw that she was very, very vulnerable and like falling apart. And so it was a moment that maybe was particular to her, but the concept, the strategy is mostly the same, So in the Reform movement, guitar, playing music for rabbis from the podium, something that moves a lot of people. Okay, so in the Orthodox community, there's no playing guitar on Shabbat, but there are other things, there are other ways. And so, an Orthodox rabbi might use language of, Kedusha and holiness and mitzvah and God and whatever. And the Reform rabbi might use, Buber, for example, or Tikkun Olam and all of that. So, it's mostly similar. So the second part of your question are, what are the differences and what are the things that make Judaism or Jewish culture? I would say it's not Judaism, it's not Torah that does this. It's our culture, especially sort of contemporary Western culture of Judaism that makes us particularly vulnerable in other ways. So, for instance, things like Jewish connectivity, right? That everybody's like super duper connected is also there's a lot of very easy boundary breaking. So, we heard this I heard this a lot from people complaining that there's too much hugging in a lot of spaces, that, in Jewish conferences, there's a lot of hugging and that it's hard to say, no, I don't want that. And so, for example, or just like people knowing everybody's everything about everything, this person is, my aunt's cousin's brother-in-law's, soccer teacher, soccer coach, or yeshiva rebbe, or whatever it is. There's like a zillion connections, and every abuser in the Jewish community is something to someone, So every abuser is going to be someone's friend or cousin or boss or something like that. So everyone's tied, and so all of those ties make it really hard to come forward. It makes it hard to make that accusation. Because somebody's always going to be someone to defend the abuser in some way. So we have that happening, for example. Another issue in the Jewish community has to do with how we socialize into gender. So first of all, we have the whole issue of, women as baby makers and that kind of thing, which, Steve Cohen had a lot of sexism in his research and his concepts of women's role in Jewish continuity and all of that. But it was, so there was that going on. But instead of being able to open, but he like single-handedly controlled a lot of what was going on in Jewish sociological research because when women would come looking for jobs, he would sometimes sexually harass them instead of saying, oh, you have a really important voice to offer, how we consider gender, for example. So these things like, multiply each other. But, the issues of women as baby makers also influences summer camp culture. There were a whole bunch of different articles on summer camps and on birthright. There's Sarah Seltzer's article about birthright, and then there was Josh Nathan Katzis wrote a whole thing in the forward about the summer camps, and there was a whole Jewish Chains for Empowered Consent, in which girls who had graduated from certain youth movements were sharing how in camps, they were always under this pressure.
Right. We're very proud that they were alums of our Rising Voices Teen Fellowship. And it came out of that program as they came together and said, we're noticing this, and this is really not okay. And how can we intervene? And also at the same time saying, hello, adults, why is it that we are the ones who are having to intervene here?
So kudos to you, JWA. Wow. just
Well,
wow. I mean,
kudos to them. They're incredible, but we're happy
yes,
to
that too.
support them.
But having somebody like you and your platform, supporting them is huge. I mean, it's huge. It makes such a big difference in how victims come forward. There's a massive difference when victims come forward between whether they're believed or not believed. When victims are believed and supported, that impacts their entire healing process, their entire self-concept for life, because and when victims come forward and they're not believed, or they're doubted, or they're called insane, or you're just ignored or dropped out of the community, like that's a lifelong impact. So you just doing that and supporting the girls or young women when they come forward is such a gift. I mean, gift to them and a gift to all of us that you do that. So that's huge. And obviously, yes, huge kudos to them for coming forward. But I don't want to minimize the role of the people who receive on the receiving end of disclosure. It's such an important moment for giving that support. Also,
and there's so much culturally, I think, that makes that hard, even just Jewishly, things like prohibitions against gossip, right? Lashon hara, right? So people use all of those kinds of things, or prohibitions against reporting a Jew to non-Jewish authorities. A lot of these kind of Jewish legal ideas get used as reasons for people to not report, or to kind of, slam someone who does say something about someone. And even things that are not religious concepts, but even just sort of bringing up the idea of we don't want to raise anti-Semitism, so we shouldn't say anything bad publicly about Jews. And, so there's a lot of those kinds of traditional ideas that get, I think, used against victims.
So what's so interesting about Lashon Hara, Lashon Hara is such a big, so anti-Semitism also, by the way, just about anti-Semitism, in the article about Michael Steinhardt in the New York Times, the entire comment section was about anti-Semitism. Oh, the New York Times is so anti-Semitic. Why do they have to mention that he's Jewish? Or we don't have time to talk about this because we have to protect Israel. And it's like, oh, what? Protecting Israel is so important. Let's not talk about this stuff. And it's like, okay, so that is totally a thing.
Right. And also it, as you point out in the book, when we focus on, when we use the lens of anti-Semitism and say, we shouldn't be attacking Michael Steinhardt because it's anti-Semitic, it's not acknowledging that his victims were also Jews. And so, but we're not supporting these other Jews. It's sort of erasing their Jewishness or lifting his Jewishness above theirs in order to say, we can't talk about this.
Which again is the question of who counts in our community. Once again, it's creating these internal hierarchies about who's important and who isn't, and who's valued and who we need and who we don't need. Absolutely. I also want to get back to the Lashon Hara thing, because that's so interesting about the Lashon. So two things I want to say. First of all, about Lashon Hara, even though it sounds like—
define Lashon Hara for people who might not be familiar with the term.
Right. So Lashon Hara is a religious precept not to gossip. Okay. And so it's very often used when stories come out or when someone discloses about abuse, especially in the Orthodox community, they'll use the term Lashon Hara to say, oh, you're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to talk about this. It's Lashon Hara. It's ruining someone's life. And not only specifically, a lot of times there have been, Orthodox rabbis writing, entire essays and articles saying, we can't be talking about this because it's Lashon Hara. So now a lot of people will associate the Lashon Hara dynamic as an Orthodox thing, but actually it is not just an Orthodox thing. It just has different phrasing in non-Orthodox circles. So in non-Orthodox circles, it sounds like, why would we ruin someone's life? Why are you being so mean? He has a family. The abuser has a family. Don't we feel bad for the family? Let's not talk. Or it might sound like, let's not air our dirty laundry in public, for example. Right. So now what's so interesting, and actually Lilith was the first one to point, the magazine Lilith ran an essay about this called Reclaiming Lashon Hara, or Reclaiming Lashon Hara, something like that. And basically in that article it was saying that Lashon Hara saves women's lives. Okay. And so, and that by sharing these stories, you're able to sort of quietly protect one another. And in my interviewees, I have interviewees with stories from the 70s and the 80s. And so and some of my interviews, this came up a bunch of times, that for years and years, the sort of Lashon Hara network, right, the sort of secret whispered network among women to sort of stay away from that guy kind of thing, that literally saved women's lives. And so there's this whole thing where you sort of realize that Lashon Hara is a silencing tool. When people say Lashon Hara, or don't air your dirty laundry in public, or this guy has a family and don't ruin his reputation over, nothing or whatever, all of those are just silencing tactics. So again, it is using this religious precept, which, I like the precept in general. Like, I really like the idea that we shouldn't be, engaging in idle gossip. Yes, that's very nice. I totally agree with that. Okay. But sharing information about potential abusers is not Lashon Hara. That is women or people protecting other people's lives. So again, as an example, that cuts across denominations, that in different denominations has slightly different language, but it's a tactic in which it's taking a spiritual precept, a potentially spiritual precept, and manipulating it in order to protect abusers. So that happens everywhere, but in each cultural setting, there's a particular language to it. So yeah.
And you call that spiritual bypass, right?
I didn't invent that term. That's a term in abuse among professionals. It's actually spiritual bypass can mean a lot of different things to different people, but in this setting, spiritual bypass is that. Spiritual bypass is where the person is, using a particular spiritual idea, not in the way that it's meant to be used. It could also look like someone saying like, oh, but this particular spiritual idea doesn't apply to me, for example. That could also be spiritual bypass, for example. So actually that another thing that makes the Orthodox community unique is that the Orthodox community has these rules about men and women not being allowed to be in the same room together, for example, or not allowed to touch. Yichud, the rule of Yichud in Orthodoxy means that a man and a woman are not allowed to be in a closed room together, which is, in most cases is taken very seriously, like in a lot of, and then there's the rule about Nagia, which says that men and women are not allowed to touch. And we're not even getting to the heteronormativity about it or the gender binary of it, but that's Orthodoxy. So what happens though is that, and Shana Aronson, who's the executive director of Magen, which is one of the organizations fighting this in Israel, she explained this to me really in a really interesting way because she deals a lot with the Orthodox community. And she said that it's incredible how women who have been keeping these rules for their entire lives suddenly encounter an abuser who says, oh, you're allowed to be alone in a room with me. I'm allowed to touch you. Right? I'm allowed to do it because I'm special, or you're special, or this is special, or whatever it is. So that's also spiritual bypass, where the abuser is like using these spiritual or religious concepts in a unique way for me. Like, I'm special, I'm unique. Yes, all of these rules have applied to you for your whole lives or whatever, but not now. And Shana talks about how this impacts women and what it takes for women to put all of that aside, put aside everything they've been taught for their whole lives, because one rabbi is sitting in front of them saying like, oh no, I'm telling you that this is special and I'm special and you're special and this is different. And so she talks about about what women have to do in order to release all personal authority and give away all authority to that person. And so that's another thing, by the way, in terms of gender socialization, is that women, and not just Orthodox women, but a lot of us were socialized into listening to authority, being nice to the rabbi, don't make waves, be nice. I hear a lot from interviewees about the socialization into be nice. Be nice, be nice, be nice. And that whole be nice thing really inhibits women's ability to listen to themselves, to listen to ourselves, sometimes, and say, hang on a second, I got bells ringing here. Something is not right, but it's like, oh, but this person across from me has authority.
Right. But the rabbi says it is. So I guess I trust the rabbi, right? And not trust myself. And I think that's part of what is so so insidious about so much of this is just how deep patriarchal culture goes, both in general and also Jewishly, right? Like whether or not you are observant, like our traditionally doesn't consider women to be legal entities, right? So
exactly.
that, like, knowing that we come from a tradition where that has been the case and in some places still is, that has an impact. It makes it harder for anyone who is, who has taken in that idea in any way to trust women as credible, authoritative sources. And I think in many communities across all backgrounds, and in many Jewish communities, male dominance is still normative. And so, and you say in your book, and I think this is a really powerful idea, like that in itself is a kind of grooming, because you are grooming women to not trust themselves and to believe that men have more authority than they do. And how we get that, how we unlearn that and get that out of our own heads is a really, really complicated and not easy process.
Yeah, it's a lifelong process in a certain way. I'm 53 years old, and I still have that voice in my head, saying like, be nice, don't make waves, don't make people upset, kind of thing. It's still there.
Yeah.
It's still there.
We had a question also about women as abusers, and you already said, of course, women can be abusers too, although the vast majority of abuse is still done by men. But talk a little bit about how, I think the question was specifically about women in religious communities, but say a little bit about that.
Oh, about women abusers. Okay, I thought I missed that in the chat. Okay, women. Women who are abusers are, for the most part, use similar tactics to men, right? In the sense of like all of the tactics of narcissism and emotional manipulation and using the tools at their disposal and power hierarchies and things like that. So, some of the people I spoke, some of my interviews who were abused by women, when we talked about these things, they sort of said like when they describe the abuse, it's really very similar, if not identical. But for instance, one woman who was abused by her headmaster in school talked about, and she was in the Orthodox community. She said that when she would tell people about it, when they tried to disclose and report, the response that she got was, "It's not so bad. What's the big deal?" Right? Because, for example, she said she got, being a lesbian isn't against the Torah, right? So, which is wrong on so many levels, because like being abused is not about a sexual relationship. If a woman is being abused by a woman, it doesn't mean that she's a lesbian at all. But also, it was this sense of like that there's something consensual about it, and also that being abused by a woman isn't so bad, like it's no big deal, kind of thing. So there's that. Another thing is that a woman who abuses a man. So there's this kind of story also where the abuser is a woman and the victim is a man. So in those kinds of situations, the level of shame is like beyond beyond anything that women might experience, because it also cuts, because what studies show is that when men come forward and say I was abused by women, they get like openly mocked. That the level of disbelief has many added layers to it. So there's a lot of research about that. And there are some people who think that kind of abuse of female on male abuse, which is currently, it's somewhere around like 7% of all abusers are women or something like that. But some people believe that number is an underestimate, because of how hard it is for a man to be able to come forward and talk about that thing. And then they also get like, technical questions like, what do you mean? And, because a lot of times victims have to explain their own sort of reactions to the abuse, and victims in general are called complicit. And, if you didn't like fight back with, an axe or something, then it's like, oh, well, you wanted it. So imagine how men experience that, whatever, we don't have to get, into graphic details about it, but you can like imagine, that for men who are victims, it's often really, really, really complicated. But in general, also, it's complicated to come forth anyway, whatever gender the abuser is. But it is also hard to talk about women who are abusers, because there is so much First of all, there's like a lack of understanding about how it works, and there's an extra added lack of belief. And also, there's also the added layer, which I also experienced myself on some level, of not really wanting to tell that story. If you're a feminist, activist especially, you don't want to be talking about women doing bad things, even feminist women doing bad things. You don't want to be the one to break that news to the world that, like, oh yeah, women could be terrible too. So, so in that sense, there are certain differences, even if the abuse itself has all the same red flags and all the same tactics.
We have a question about the impact of having women rabbis in the rabbinate now and how that may be changing things. And I just want to say, before you answer that question, one of the things that was so striking in your book is how you talk about, and I knew this because in JWA's collection, as some of you may know, JWA has been doing some collecting. We have a project called Archiving Me Too that we started right after Me Too, where we started collecting stories of sexual abuse in the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community, that Jews experience, basically because we felt like it was such an important story and there needed to be a kind of historical record. Again, much like you were saying at the beginning, we weren't interested in doing investigations. That's not our role, but we felt like collecting those stories and people's reflections on them, giving women a chance to speak. We know how powerful that can be to be heard, and not just heard, but to say this is part of history and it's significant and it carries weight and we are going to preserve it and, make your story part of the larger story. And I've done some research with that collection, which is ongoing, and we've shared it with researchers, including you. And I was shocked by how many of the things that were submitted to us were by women rabbis. And you write about how women rabbis kind of get it from all sides, right? They get it from their congregants, they get it from their colleagues, they get it from their board chairs, they get, it is a very difficult situation.
Yeah. Yes. First of all, again, kudos to you on doing all that. And again, JWA is such a leader in these things, and wow. So I really just want to put that out there again. Yeah. I had a bunch of my interviewees are women rabbis, and the women rabbis reporting on this had like lists and lists of stories, from rabbinical school on, getting it from all sides, getting it from professors and teachers and sometimes colleagues, and then congregants and board members and senior rabbis. And a lot of times women rabbis are very alone. And also sort of if a woman who's working as, let's say, an associate rabbi is kind of like, she's an easy target, easily dispensable. For example, I heard this over and over again, a woman who said that she had been the associate rabbi for like 15 years, and she was sure that eventually she would have a future in the synagogue. But when she came forward, she didn't even come forward about her own experience of sexual abuse. She came forward about other people's experiences with sexual abuse, and someone who had been hired as like the education director in their synagogue, and she became like the megaphone for their stories, because she said, like, how can we hire this person? He was fired by his other synagogue, thousands of miles away. He came to our community and tried to start this new life, but we know the truth about him. And she came forward with that, and she lost her job from that, And so, stories like that. There was another woman I spoke to who had been, working as a pulpit rabbi for a long time, and eventually just quit after like 30 years of being a pulpit rabbi. She quit because of all of this. She just had enough. Like, she just had enough. So again, it goes back to what we were talking about before about loss of talent for the community. Like, there is such an issue of loss of talent around the rabbinate here.
Right. And it's so hard for women rabbis who already are often trying not to be sexualized in their roles. And then if they talk about being sexually harassed or assaulted, it is calling attention, to themselves as sexual beings in a certain way. And that can make them a further target. And it is very, very complicated. And I do believe that having more women in the rabbinate is helping bring some of these issues out and notice these, women are calling attention to some of these power dynamics and naming them as things that exist that are, very prominent and are not okay. And I think that that's there's a question about how rabbinical schools are dealing with this. And the truth is, like the reform movement has been going through an enormous reckoning around this. And I don't think that would have happened if there weren't so many women in rabbinical school and women rabbis who, there was finally a sort of tipping point of being like, okay, we have to deal with this. And other movements are and will be following suit. And it's very painful. It's not a simple thing. And it's not a finished thing, but it is beginning to happen. I want to give kudos to the Women's Rabbinic Network and Rabbi Mary Zamor, who's been a huge leader in keeping this issue at the forefront and not letting it be dropped. There's always this tendency to want to address a little piece of it and then be like, okay, we did it. We're done. Let's move on. And as we all know, this is not a quick fix, right? This isn't something you talk about once and then you're done. And Rabbi Zamor has been huge in really just like keeping that.
Yes, huge. I was going to say the same thing. When we think about women making a difference, she's the first. Women rabbis making a difference, she's the model for that, for using her platform to make change. And that's not simple. It's not simple to be within a system and be trying to make change within your system. That's very hard to do. But I agree that women rabbis have a particular, potentially a very important role to play in making this kind of change. Absolutely.
So maybe to end on a maybe slightly positive note, a lot has happened since the beginning of Me Too. There's still a lot that needs to happen. I think there's some questions about how much energy it's taking to keep these conversations at the centerpiece, but how would you assess where we are? Are there reasons to be hopeful about how the Jewish community is responding to these issues and confronting them?
That's a really complicated question that I consider a lot, and I get asked a lot. Sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it feels like there's change happening, So, and we do have victories. Like I would count, like what Karen mentioned before, Steve Cohen, was a victory. The issue is that it's sort of like the tip of the iceberg. And I've been thinking a lot about the story of Chaim Valder, who was an Orthodox celebrity author who was discovered a year ago, that he had dozens of victims going back decades. And so when he first came out, so there was a very strong response in the Jewish community. His books were taken off shelves. He was fired from jobs and things like that. So a lot of people said, hey, look, we're experiencing change. Look, new things, there's accountability. But then after he committed suicide, a lot of that sympathy shifted to his family. The chief rabbi went to visit the, Valder's family, not the victims, and so it was sort of the sense of like, well, have we, haven't we? And then of course, now we have a lot of conversations in our community around the issue of teshuvah, a lot of people asking, oh, when are we allowed to bring the abusers back? And it's like, we haven't even finished the reckoning. We've only just started really, and already there's talk about teshuvah. So that's a little concerning. But overall, I would say, yes, we're going in the right direction. People coming forward, is definitely a step in the right direction. The girls who did the voices that you talked about, they are super inspiring. I sort of have hope that, the younger generation is going to be less tolerant of all of this than we are, and they're going to be the ones leading the change. And they're going to be, calling us to account, how come we didn't do more? But I think that in about, around over the next 10 years, as these young people emerge as our communal leaders, 10, 15 years, I think that's when we're really going to see the fruits of all of this.
Yeah. And I think so much of this work, part of what's so hard about it is that it's not like any social change work. It's slow and it's not linear. And we have to have the resources. We have to cultivate in one another the resources to be able to sit with the hard stuff and do it
and just listen.
Yeah.
And just believe. Somebody asked before just a second what to do when you're confronted with this. It's really very simple. Just believe, hold space. When somebody's disclosing, all we really have to do is just hold a space and believe them. That's so powerful. And we all have the power to do that.
Right. It's about listening and yeah, I think that is the most important piece. Well, I want to thank you, Elana, for this conversation tonight, for your important work. There really hasn't been a study like this before, so it is so important to have it all. You pull so many important ideas into one place. And I thank you for that. As
My pleasure. And it's always great talking to you, Judith. And I'm really, really super grateful for your leadership. The community is so lucky to have you doing your work. So
thank you. And I want to say to everyone here, thank you for being here, for being part of this conversation. And as we mentioned, some of the testimonies that Elana drew upon came from the Archiving Me Too collection at JWA, and we are still collecting those stories. So if you have a story that you would want to add to the historical record, you can share it either written or audio on our site at jwa.org/metoo or through our story collecting app. As I also mentioned in the course of our conversation, we've produced 2 podcast episodes that are relevant to this topic, one about Me Too, which draws also on our Archiving Me Too collection, and one on toxic hookup culture in Jewish youth groups and camps with the founders of Jewish Teens for Empowered Consent. And so you can turn to those as ways to explore further, and of course, read Elana's book. This was the last of our 4-part series of book talks for this winter, for the early part of the winter, but have no fear. We will be back with many more programs in 2023. For our next series, we're actually trying something new. We're going to be doing a film club. You will watch the films, which are by and about American Jewish women. They're also available streaming online. You'll watch those on your own. Then you'll join us for conversations with experts on each film. It's going to be really fun, a great winter activity. And for those of you in Australia, a great summer activity. We will begin on January 26th. So keep an eye out for the registration link. I hope to see you there. Until next time, wishing everybody a Hanukkah that is absolutely filled with light, a happy secular new year.
Amen.
Can't wait to see all of you. May 2023 be a better year for our world.
Yay. Sounds great.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Good night. And thank you so much, Elana. This was wonderful.